Let's go! TJ Finley to Auburn. Is LSU missing out on something special? But look, I don't want you to comment just yet. I want you to really sit down and watch this video because there is one stat that shows LSU football quarterback success more than any other stat, and TJ had it working against him. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, because Max Johnson kind of sort of has it working against him as well. So, look, we're going to be completely honest today about TJ Finley, who he is as a quarterback. But what's going to make this TJ Finley video different is we're going to investigate if he was actually any good in high school, because you would be shocked how many LSU quarterbacks they recruited that were not dominant in high school at all. And it's tough because these are their senior year statistics. Now, we're going to dive a little deeper into these stats over the next couple of weeks, but I want to apply these stats when it comes to TJ Finley because he was not that great at Ponchatoula, and there were a lot of reasons why. TJ's high school career is, out of any of the quarterbacks I studied, by far the most interesting and complicated. And this is a very key piece of information right here. TJ Finley entered his junior season as a 2020 LSU commitment. But what's fascinating was TJ Finley's sophomore season, they went 2-8. They were not great, and TJ Finley wasn't really that great himself. 14 touchdowns, 8 interceptions with less than 2,000 yards passing. Now, we're going to get back to these numbers, but this is what's going to blow your mind. LSU offered TJ Finley with a 2-8 record. So, the first thing you have to understand when it comes to quarterback recruiting and projecting, and we'll actually crunch these numbers, is colleges, do not care about what you did in high school, which is funny because they should, and I'm going to show you a few things in a second. The reason why is because quarterbacks have to commit earlier than other positions, because oftentimes only one quarterback commits per class because only one quarterback plays. Perfect example is Walker Howard. He obviously is a 5-star quarterback, and I've shared how special I think he's going to be, but he committed to LSU without ever even making a varsity start. He also committed before his junior season. So despite going 2-8, LSU said, look, TJ is 6'6", he's got a cannon, and we can morph him into something special at LSU. And once again, I'm going to show you that one stat that proves more than anything else that an LSU quarterback is going to be successful. And it blew my mind. It's going to blow yours. I'm going to keep pumping it up. I promise you, you're going to love it. So that's the thing. Once again, 2-8. But this is where it gets fascinating. Ponchatoula is a great program. Why did they go 2-8? Well, midway through the season, their head coach had 273 career wins, has won state championships, but he ran the option. Let's see if we can use TJ Finley's skill set to our advantage. But here's the thing. It had an effect on their performance. So here we go. Let's go back to TJ Finley's stats. His junior season, there was some improvement from when he was as a sophomore, which is what you expect, okay? In the same amount of games, 1,000 more yards passing. He shrunk his interceptions, 23 touchdowns. So we should expect as a senior that TJ Finley is going to take his game to an even higher level, and that simply did not happen. His stats were near identical. In fact, he regressed despite playing one more game. And look, 238.5 yards per game isn't that bad, but you also look at his rushing stats. You know, he's obviously a really good red zone quarterback sneak type of quarterback, but it's not good. And what's funny is you take a look at this right here, his game-by-game statistics. Only about half of the time he threw for 300 yards as a senior, but to this game against Destrehan. And right now you're looking at a YouTube clip where you can watch this full game for free. And TJ Finley wasn't just bad, he was beyond abysmal in this game. He started off the game in the first couple of drives with multiple interceptions, one of which was almost returned for a touchdown. He fumbled a snap. You know, it's not what you would expect in his senior season. It was really bad. It at this level, you should be dominating. 312 yards passing, well, that was because Destrehan, of course, had a huge 27-0 lead at half. And it's not as if TJ Finley didn't have weapons to throw to. His younger brother was a 3-star receiver, albeit just a sophomore. But Cody Finley is a really good receiver. He also had Jacoby Matthews his senior season as an option to throw the football to. They had another kid who runs a 4.7 and is also a really good wide receiver. So I watched that game and I was like, goodness. And look, maybe not all the games were like that. He had some other good games. But even when you look at the tape of those games, it was the same thing. Him staring down a guy and just rifling a ball in a tight window, which was a lot of his success last season. Now, it may seem like I am really hard on TJ Finley here. Not really. It's just some honest truth. And he didn't have a good offensive line, which kind of talks about, it's kind of ironic because during his LSU games, he didn't have a great offensive line. But his offensive line at Ponchatoula, which for years had been running the option, TJ Finley was playing at a school that it's not what they do. They ran the option for years, and then they tried this spread offense attack, and here's what happened to Ponchatoula. It hurt them. So here's the thing. I don't like using wins and losses as a quarterback stat, but this is going to blow your mind. The year before TJ Finley became the starting quarterback, Ponchatoula was a 10-3 team running Hank's old system. Then in 2017, 2018, and 2019, they just didn't figure out this TJ Finley experiment, and they went 10-21 as a program. And the year after he left, just put Jacoby Matthews at quarterback, who is going to be a superstar at LSU. They went 7-2. So maybe TJ, if he was at a better system program where they produce quarterbacks, I don't know where that could be. Maybe he would have been better served. But he wants to play for the hometown team, which lets you know this. He was not ready to perform as a true freshman. He didn't win in high school. He didn't dominate in high school. So what made us think that he was going to dominate his first season at a Division I program with all the things that were going up against him? And like I said in my initial TJ Finley deep dive, the one thing that helped him out the most in those 2 wins where he was really, really good is that he had extra time to prepare. And there was a lot of other factors. If you want to watch that video, I'll link it down below. But that was prior to what I knew about him as a high school quarterback. But that's the thing. Why did LSU throw him out into the wolves when we knew that he was a project, that he was, it's going to take year 2, year 3, I believe, for him, no earlier than year 3. I don't want to get into his Auburn situation too much because I just don't see him in any scenario beating out Bo Nix, but still, he's year 3, year 4, which we'll get to in just a second. Now, why didn't LSU decide to play Max Johnson from the get-go, knowing that TJ Finley was not that great his senior season at Ponchatoula? And, well, the truth is that Max Johnson was also not good in high school. Well, he wasn't dominant in high school, and I was actually blown away by this. So, as a junior, Max Johnson completed 39% of his passes for 8 touchdowns and 6 interceptions, and that is obviously not that great. So, as a senior, he obviously got better, but in 15 games, just over 2,000 yards passing for 142 yards per game. He did throw for 30 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, which makes a lot of sense when you know Max Johnson as a quarterback. He's not the best vertical thrower, but I do want to include this. Max Johnson, if you actually go back and watch some of his senior tape, he makes some absolutely amazing throws and runs, but his rushing stats weren't all that great either. 182 yards on the ground. Now, that's including some sacks probably in there, so his rushing stats are probably more in the 250, 300-yard range, but still a long run of 46 yards. So, yeah, more than likely it was about like 250, 300 yards in actual rushing. And this is the thing. When he became a senior, Jake Johnson, I'm telling you, this guy just blew my mind how good he was. He actually became the full-time starting tight end / slot receiver, which is obviously Max's younger brother, a 4-star tight end who is currently committed to LSU. And when you actually go look at Max Johnson's stats, and you look, his senior season in 15 games, 1, 2, 3 games where he threw for more than 200 yards. Now, they did win a lot of games. They did blow some teams out, which means, of course, you're going to, deflate the ball and run it and, knee down at the end. So they were dominant, and that, of course, puts a ceiling on what you can do statistically. But it is interesting that, like TJ Finley, in his final playoff game, even though he did throw for 2 touchdowns and no interceptions, and TJ Finley had a bunch of bad picks, Max Johnson was 7 of 20 for 96 yards, 35% passing. So what's funny is, in high school, they were the same exact quarterbacks that they were as true freshmen, right? Max Johnson was very risk-averse, but he put LSU in position to win, in particular that Florida game. Now, I've shared this a few times against Ole Miss. He did miss a lot of throws, but to Max Johnson's credit, the weather did have drastic changes in both of those games. And TJ Finley, in his games, also had back-breaking turnovers early in those games. I'm telling you, the Destrehan game, you will have battle wounds watching that game in comparison to what he did against Auburn. Now, that is really fascinating. And what makes it even more fascinating was Max Johnson. Let's take a look at his junior year statistics. Look at that. He only had 1, 2, 3, 4 games where he threw for 100 yards passing. They won a lot of games, though. That's the one thing I could say about Max Johnson. Not so much his junior season, but his senior season at a high level, Watkinsville, Georgia, they won a lot. Maybe this game against Blessed Trinity was in the middle of a snowstorm or something. I don't know. Boom! I'm looking at you right now. Yes, you're enjoying this video. I know you've already subscribed. I know you've already gotten your PHL shirt. Link down below. That's a good way to support an independent creator like me. I freaking love TJ and Max. I think they're both fantastic kids. I love Big Bad Brad Johnson on TikTok, the Super Bowl winning dad. And I want to be clear, I'm not trying to be critical of high schoolers just to do it. It's more so trying to better evaluate this position that is really difficult to evaluate. So before we move on in this data, I want it to be known that, that I'm just doing this from an objective viewpoint. Let's go. Before we dive into these numbers, I want you to look at this, okay? These are the top 2022 quarterback recruits, okay? We touched on Walker Howard just a little bit earlier. And I want you to see, in comparison in particular with other positions, look at all these kids that have committed before they ever even played their senior years of high school, okay? Look at that. The top 32 quarterbacks, 28 of them have committed before they ever take a snap. Now, take a look at this from an NFL perspective. Imagine how different the NFL draft would be if teams were selecting the quarterbacks before the seasons even began. And one more thing before we crunch this data. Remember, it's sometimes not even the high school film itself that gets a recruit an elite ranking. This is from a guy that is very familiar with the evaluation process. I'm keeping him anonymous for a reason. A lot of the ratings come from just 7-on-7s and camps, which, of course, isn't actual football. I think those camps are better to evaluate receivers and defensive backs, but look, you can't get hit in 7-on-7. There's weird quarterback timing rules in 7-on-7. So it's not necessarily the best way to evaluate. Now, oftentimes these recruiting services get it right, but when you actually go look at a high school kid's tape, take for instance, here's the data, Rob Bolden, who is a transfer from Penn State to LSU. He was a national 91st ranked quarterback, but he averaged 110 yards per game total as a senior, rushing and throwing 110 yards per game in high school. So that shows you that sometimes, or more often than not, the rating is more to do with your projection than what you've actually produced on the field. Now, that's the thing. The evaluation can get really strange. So let's actually do some rearranging of these numbers. Let's sort every LSU quarterback. And before we continue, you're looking to the left here. Option A is obviously an LSU great, a really good starter, guys that we want. Option Bs are more replaceable guys. I have Garrett Nussmeier listed as a B. Who knows what's going to happen? And then option Cs are guys that never played or just weren't good at all. So, there we go. We want option A's, especially at quarterback. Option A's gets us bowl wins and championships. Now, let's sort the data in order of the average yards these players put out per game. And you see a guy like Danny Etling, his high school ran the veer, and which obviously heavily affected his stats, but he still only put up 125.6 yards per game. Peter Parrish, even though his team won a state championship, he had, Amante Spivey and a few other elite players around him. He only put up 125.8 yards per game. But what you'll see here, though, is Zach Mettenberger and Matt Flynn, two of the best LSU quarterbacks, two of the top 5 quarterbacks of the past 2 decades, both averaged less than 200 yards per game in high school. You get down to Jamarcus Russell, 287.1, which is obviously really, really good. But still, you go down this list and you see 3 elites right here. And we'll touch on Ryan Perlew in just a second. 339 from Joe Burrow, 369 from Myles Brennan. And you'll see a lot of correlation between average yards per game in high school, which, makes some sense. What about average touchdowns per game? Let's sort that. We sorted. Let's sort on column here. So average touchdowns per game. Let's put it right here. Get a better look at it. And you see here, we want to sort it from bottom to top. Once again, Rob Bolden, Danny Etling, Zach Mettenberger, Matt Flynn, and Jamarcus Russell. So you see here, it does not mean if you weren't elite in high school, when it comes to yards or touchdowns, you could still be successful. Zach Mettenberger was very successful. Matt Flynn, as many of you know, very successful. Jamarcus Russell, only 2.1 touchdowns per game as a senior, okay? Now, you can do the same thing for completions, and the same guys stay at the top. So you have your Joe Burrows and Myles Brennans that were stat geniuses, and Ryan Perlew, a stat master. In fact, he is by far the best quarterback when it comes to their prep performance on this list, outside of maybe Russell Shepard, Joe Burrow, and Myles are close behind. But Ryan Perlew was beyond ridiculous in high school. Then, it doesn't matter which data you put it in. There's option A's, option B's, and option C's, because you see Zach Mettenberger and Matt Flynn and Danny Etling. I list them as an option B. I think that's fair. Maybe option A. Those are 3 guys that won a lot of games at LSU. So, the first conclusion we can make is that high school statistics can tell us if a quarterback may or may not be overrated, but it's not the be-all, end-all when it comes to successful LSU quarterbacks. But I decided to save this best for last, this magical stat, the one thing that has 100% accuracy, whether or not an LSU quarterback is going to be good, and it's not a sexy stat. In fact, it's something that we all deal with. How old were you when you made your first start? Or what year were you in your progression? Okay? And you'll notice this. Direct correlation. Guys that started year 2, or they had an LSU start in year 2, all the way down to getting their first start in year 4, their progression turned out to succeed. And it heavily correlates when you became the full-time starter at LSU, okay? That's the first start. So you look at right here, first LSU start. Matt Flynn had his first LSU start in year 3 of his progression. So he redshirted, then his freshman season, he backed up Jamarcus Russell, and then as a third-year sophomore. Obviously, Jamarcus Russell got hurt, and he started the Miami game, Matt Flynn, and played fine. And then year 5 was actually the year he became a full-time starter. And you look at Rohan Davey, you see the list of all these LSU legends. You notice this. Every LSU quarterback that got a start since the beginning of the championship era was a year 3 or further full-time starter. They were successful. Okay? And every single quarterback, obviously, that never got a start or became the full-time starter in year 1 or year 2. Now, obviously, we don't know what Max Johnson and TJ Finley will do for the rest of their career, but every single one of them were not good. Not good. Jarrett Lee, Jordan Jefferson, that's very complicated, but they are nowhere close to the top 5 quarterbacks, nowhere close to Rohan Davey or anyone like that, even though they did win a lot of games. Bless Myles being a toxic quarterback coach, but Brandon Harris did have elite stats. He had better stats than Jamarcus Russell, Matt Flynn, Danny Etling, all those guys, but he was forced to start as a true freshman and then became the full-time starter in year 2. The same thing is kind of true for Anthony Jennings. He had a start in the bowl game, and they both fell off a cliff. Jarrett Lee was forced into being a full-time starter in year 2. You saw the interceptions. Direct correlation. Now, obviously, it's not the largest sample, and it would be a little more interesting if we could dive into high school stats of all the other quarterbacks, but that would take a lot of time. But at LSU, it is wild. That is so important. Now, each and every quarterback that started from year 3 as the full-time starter succeeded. Now, obviously, Myles Brennan, we only have a 3-game sample, but in those 3 games, he was beyond phenomenal. And when you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Let's take TJ Finley, for example, because that's what looped you guys into this video. I know this has been a deep dive, and if you're at this point, thank you so much. Now, what was a bad game TJ Finley had this season? Well, he had the great start against South Carolina, and then the Auburn game happened. Who is he going up against? Well, Kevin Steele, who has been one of the best defensive coordinators in the SEC for years now. The same Kevin Steele who the year before was the only defensive coordinator to really slow down Joe Burrow, okay? So the year before, with no offensive help, playing 88 plays, okay, what Auburn did versus Joe Burrow was simply astonishing. So Kevin Steele going up against basically the same offensive coordinator in Steve Ensminger, and he's at home, is going up against a true freshman quarterback. Now, Joe Burrow and pretty much every other year 4 guy on, they're not really taking college coursework anymore. They are focusing full-time on football, whereas a true freshman, you're taking all different kinds of classes that you didn't even know about. You're taking, in high school, you're taking finance, you're taking accounting, philosophy 101. Imagine trying to learn the inner workings of Friedrich Nietzsche, and then 4 days later, after taking an exam on Rene Descartes or whatever, you're trying to figure out Kevin Steele, one of the sharpest minds in all of college football. You're trying to decipher his defense. You know, it's hard. This is a really hard thing, especially over the last, couple of years where this position has become so much more complex. And there's all the pressure of being an LSU quarterback when it comes to this. So, look, if LSU, and if LSU looked at this data, what I would recommend is to, by all accounts, make sure that we aren't starting guys in year 1 of their development, year 2. Let's try and aim for guys to be year 3. Year 2 is okay because, the quarterbacking is just so advanced. So you could apply this to Gary Nussmeier, which we're going to do more Nussmeier content over the next couple of weeks. That's why this is so important to look at all this data and look at high school numbers and see if there is something, because I was just looking at data for forever and it just finally clicked that how old you are when you start really matters. Now, it varies. There are some successful true freshman quarterbacks. Take Jalen Hurts, for instance, but Jalen Hurts, of course, is being coached by the greatest coach of all time. He had Cam Robinson blocking for him, Damian Harris and Josh Jacobs to hold the football to, and Calvin Ridley, Cam Sims, and O.J. Howard to throw the football to as well. Now, he was phenomenal, but, eventually Jalen Hurts regressed before he became his full self at Oklahoma. So, true freshmen starting, or just in general, or even year two starters, it's so hard. It really is so hard to do. It's kind of hard for me to wish, TJ, all the success in the world, because he is at Auburn and he is a West rival. So, that does have a direct influence on LSU. But obviously, individually, I have nothing against any recruit ever. I wish all of them nothing but the best. And obviously, this gets into another question. Does what you see today favor Myles Brennan now, who had phenomenal high school stats? I mean, he was beyond phenomenal. And at the very least, only Joe Burrow and Ryan Perrilloux had better numbers on that list than Myles Brennan in high school. And he is a year 4 guy when he became the full-time starter last season. So maybe that data changes your opinion on whether or not Myles Brennan should start over Max Johnson. There's so many things we can do with this, and that's why if this is your first time, obviously subscribe and come by our live streams. It is Power Hour LSU. Boom! So if you want more TJ Finley content, boom, this was my initial deep dive talking about more than just the quarterback position, and you definitely want to watch it. Oh, we're doing leftover boudin tonight. Let's go!